Hey y'all, this is D-Rock.
This is Cam.
And this is
The Heartbeat.
Welcome back to Season 3 of The Heartbeat.
We're thrilled to be back and have a great lineup of guests for you this season.
Speaking of which, we're kicking things off today by sitting down with independent journalist Jim Krueger, whose recently released podcast, The Road That Killed a City, chronicles the history of Hartford's urban planning and the impact of the I-84 viaduct's construction on the city and its people.
We're also joined by friend of the pod, Liz Ferrari, as co-host.
Without further ado, let's jump right into things.
So my name is Jim, obviously, and we already cleared that, but I am pretty much a lifelong Hartford area resident. I was born in West Hartford. I grew up in West Hartford my whole life. I now live in the West End, not too far from here, and I was going to be a journalist and studied journalism in college and really liked radio and then podcasting, so this whole thing kind of worked for me.
Well, I would not sell yourself short there, Jim, because I think that you can call yourself a journalist after having put out this podcast. It's
amazing.
It's quite a feat.
Yeah,
Thank
the
you.
research is really compelling.
Yeah, and it was really fun. It took a while and it took a lot of waiting to hear from the right people, and a lot of, I think, I guess I'll sell myself short again, but a lot of the quality came from the people I was able to talk to.
So now, how did you pick some of your guests? Because you picked to speak to people that weren't necessarily when you're thinking about putting together like an information history, you picked sort of people in the neighborhood versus sort of going to government officials and things like that. Like, why is that the direction you went in?
Well, the government officials didn't get back to me. That's the first part. I don't really blame them, because I basically was like, hey, I'm a guy, I wasn't at this time a professional. Partway through the research, I was able to say I'm a journalism graduate, not a journalism student. But I wasn't working for any organization. I kind of had to be like, hey, I'm a guy making a podcast about Hartford, and I had no idea where to start, because as we can probably get into a bit more, when you're in West Hartford, it's right next to Hartford, but it's also like a world away, especially when you're where I was growing up, which is near Farmington, closer to Farmington than Hartford. I looked up some Facebook groups, so I found one about transportation, and basically just reached out to that and was like, hey, this is a good place to start. Who would be interested in being interviewed for a podcast? Anyone who's just kind of, knows something about anything related to the viaduct or just transportation or the current situation. And I found a guy named Tony Charles, who is this wonderful man who lives in South Green, which is basically just in Frog Hollow, but you just kind of keep on going. It's like Frog or Park in Maine, that kind of area. He works for the Center for Latino Progress, but he mainly just works on advocacy for bike lanes and getting bikes to people in the neighborhood, and that's the short description of what he does. And from there, he recommended some other people. He recommended Carrie Provost, who is kind of like an independent journalist and also works for the Connecticut Historical Society. We found some other people, just kind of from that, like when you study journalism, one of the first things you learn is the last question you ask in any interview is, who should I talk to next? So that kind of led me down the path that I was on, and there were some other things, like I kind of realized, I kind of, that chain kind of ran out of people. There was like Jack Doherty, who was a professor at Trinity, who I actually found because he wrote an article that Tony Charles showed me. So there's cool stuff like that. After that kind of chain ran dry, I just kind of wrote the script and was like, what else do I need? I need people who grew up there. I need like a historian. So that's where I found the Mark Twain Center, and I reached out to them as like a good historical
Shout out
perspective.
to the Mark Twain Center.
Yeah. I was doing research at the Hartford Public Library and the Hartford History Center, and that was an awesome resource. So that's where I did pretty much all my research, and that's where you can find what people were saying at the time, written down. People who are pretty much all no longer here today, because this was in the 40s, and these are grown men talking about this in the 40s, which is really the people you need to talk to. and that's all we really have left from them. And Steve Harris, who's probably my favorite interview, who grew up in the North End and still lives in the North End, he does a lot of stuff with the Hartford Public Library, so they were kind of like, you need to talk to him.
It's definitely a who you know kind of city, which sounds like you found some really, really great people as you went through this podcast.
Yeah, I think part of the success that I've had is just in people's interest in what has gone so wrong in Hartford. I mean, that was what piqued my
What are you talking about? We're so perfect.
I think people are really interested in talking about it, because people are really engaged in it. So that also really helped.
So do you think that, like, throughout your interviews, do you think overall people want the city to succeed? Like, what do people want from your experience to see happen in Hartford? Like, what's their experience with it so far, and then what?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people have different goals. I would say, and I was talking to a very, select group of people who know about this topic in some, sense. Most of them are experts just by research or just by living here their whole life and having lived through everything. I would say that kind of makes you an expert.
Absolutely.
And I would say mainly, if I could really, as kind of a non-specific way as possible, Hartford's very separated, not just by race, but by class, by town, by where you live. I think people want to see that change.
Yeah.
I think people want to see people from West Hartford going into Hartford without, fearing that they'll just get robbed or killed, which, trust me, is a huge concern for some people who live like 2 miles away from Park Street.
Oh yes,
and would never go there in a million years. And that's probably why I kind of started making the podcast, was because I grew up in West Hartford, and I was like, why can I not go to Hartford? Like, why is Hartford such this terrible place? And now I live here, and it's not bad. It's nice.
Right?
And there are a lot of nice things about it, so I don't want to paint it in such a negative light, but it's tough because everything's just so separated, and there's all these stigmas and just stereotypes about the city from the outside and from the inside, and I think a lot of people just want to get rid of that.
I support getting rid of those 100%.
You are on the right podcast to be evangelizing about that.
So I had a question about your surprises within this podcast, within this project. What surprised you the most?
This is not the first time I've been asked this question, and I didn't have an answer the first time, and it's tough for me.
Stumped him.
Yeah, you did. I was surprised by how blatant people were about, what they wanted to do with downtown and with the city. I didn't know how extreme it went.
Yeah.
And I kind of had this idea when I was first dreaming it up, when I knew nothing about the topic of how it would go. And it really was when I got to, I didn't think I had a great podcast until I went to the library and started reading everything. And when you read Robert Moses saying, we need to move the highway north of the city just so the poor, just because the poor people, we don't want the poor people going into downtown Hartford. And he literally says it, and is like, the road is going to separate them, so we need to separate the downtown, the business district, from the poor people. And I was just kind of like, well, there it is right there, that. I didn't think I'd find what I was looking for so blatantly written down.
That's D-Rock's favorite person.
Yeah, there aren't too many people in real life that come close to being comic book supervillains, but Robert Moses is one of those people.
Yeah.
I mean, when you look at what he did to New York City, when you look at what he did to Long Island, and his whole goal was segregation.
Pretty much, yeah. And that's the thing, I was looking through all these documents, and I was there, and this was about a year ago. I was going into the Hartford Public Library, and there's this wonderful woman named Maureen who works there, and she's kind of the person who runs the History Center, and we're looking through all these documents, because I'm there by myself, and I'm the only one there at the time, and we're looking through, I'm looking through all these engineering documents and all these public records, people saying, oh, we need to make room for cars, this and that. And then she gives me this pamphlet, this 3-page pamphlet by Robert Moses, advocating for the road to be the highway, what would become I-84. It wasn't a thing yet. The interstate system wasn't a thing yet, but this proposed highway to be moved from south of Hartford to north of Hartford, just to cut off the poor neighborhood to the north.
Right, and one of the hidden things that you never hear about within Hartford circles, only old school folks talk about it, is the 1968 riots.
Mm-hmm.
All right, can you give us some insight as far as his emotions?
So Steve Harris is probably the most fascinating person I could have talked to in the podcast. He grew up in the North End, on Windsor Avenue, and I think he still lives there. He went to war in Vietnam, and as he says in the podcast, he left Hartford and it was an integrated city, and he came back and it was a segregated city. So he talks about going to Vietnam I think he went for a year, and he came back. And when he came back, it was right after Martin Luther King had gotten assassinated, and there was riots in downtown Hartford. And at that point, a lot of people had moved out of the North End. Police had kind of put all of downtown Hartford in a bit of lockdown. He comes back and he describes this downtown Hartford that was packed, that was busy, that was full of life, and it's just dead, and how it kind of stayed that way. So I think it's important to note, with the events of the summer of 2020, we've learned that there's a lot of different opinions on riots going on in the world. Obviously, riots don't just come out of nowhere. It's not like, everything's fine, but we're just gonna riot.
Unless it's soccer.
Oh, it's Sunday. I think I'll riot today.
Yeah. Unless the Eagles won.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, there is that. I think an important thing to note is, and I was even looking, and I was looking through this, and Steve Harris is a really interesting look into it because of where he was in Vietnam, and he leaves and he comes back, and it's totally different. People tend to blame the riots as why everyone left Hartford. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important to address that's not necessarily the case. People say oh, well, everything was fine and North Hartford was integrated, and then there were riots about Martin Luther King, and it was unsafe by that point. I think that was, from what I can look up, and I wish I'd actually found this information before I released the podcast. I found it out after. This was not the first riot in the North End. The first riot was, it escalated from what was just a protest, but it was actually a riot. I think it was in 1967, so before the Martin Luther King riots, and it was people protesting what they saw as segregation in their neighborhood. So, it didn't kind of come from nowhere. And,
right.
and things weren't totally fine until Martin Luther King got assassinated, and things had kind of been getting worse in the neighborhood. And obviously I wasn't there. This is just things I've read. But when you read that there was, at first, the first riot was about the segregation. It wasn't, the riots didn't cause the segregation. So that put a lot of people on alert in Hartford and made it that people didn't really want to go. And there wasn't really anything to do at that point in downtown Hartford because it had all been, reshaped.
Sort of vacuumed out.
Yeah.
One of the comparisons that I've made, and certainly on the show before, is that Hartford's a cubicle city. Everybody goes into work and then they leave Hartford and they don't care who keeps the lights on or who keeps the streets clean.
That was one of my favorite quotes in your podcast, was about whether the city is actually a city or it's a glorified corporate park.
Yeah. So that was very much the intention of the design, was kind of getting into the idea of what people wanted Hartford to be, what people wanted a city to be at the time, which was, downtown, that's where we're going to put the business, and we need to separate business and life. It's worked for some people, if you can afford it, it works pretty well. If you can leave Hartford, which for some people they couldn't, be near the highway, it works. But yeah, it's a weird thing that we, especially in America and really in Hartford, went full throttle on.
Yeah.
This concept, and it goes back to a lot of different things, a lot of different weird things that I kind of get into in the podcast. I might take exception to, in a way, is I think, when you build a fancy new road, like when we built the highway into Hartford, it made people think, okay, I should drive into downtown Hartford. I should drive everywhere that I go. I I don't need to bike anywhere. I don't need to take the bus anywhere because our entire city has been designed for cars and for driving literally everywhere. Building a fancy new tunnel that is under the city kind of still pushes that narrative of, oh, we should still drive everywhere. And that I don't think is the best option, especially in a city. And that's kind of what I want to get people thinking about is, yeah, driving is very convenient, but if we set up an entire city for cars as we have, you know, we lose a lot of things. We lose a lot of like our connectability and being able to go places easily.
I think a lot of people forget that cities weren't built this way because the free market decided that we should have highways going through cities.
No. Yeah.
Right.
This was intentionally planned and just planned wrong. We should design our cities for other things like walkability and public transportation, maybe.
And sustainability.
And sustainability.
As we move forward.
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, obviously sustainability is important, but people, you know, there's a lot about electric cars, and that's one of the things that really kind of gets me angry is like you have all these politicians now who are like, we need to invest in electric cars and public transportation. And it's like,
right?
No, put them the other way around, because not all of our problems are going to be solved by electric cars. Electric cars are expensive. Even if you lower the price, they're going to be expensive. And, you know, part of the point is that a lot of people can't afford cars, or cars are very expensive.
Well, and how does transportation equity play into this, sort of in your research? And how,
yeah,
I think a little bit about classism and things like that.
So my big thing is transportation equity is incredibly important, but even if it doesn't affect you, you know, there's still a lot to be gained by designing our city for, you know, more affordable and easier transportation, such as biking, such as walking, such as buses. People really like cities that are designed for walking.
Yeah.
And, you know, that's been evidently clear through a lot of research around the world, that pedestrianized streets, not only do people really like pedestrianized city centers, people, you know, business owners really like pedestrianized city centers. Yeah. Places where people can walk instead of just driving from point A to point B. If we can design a city where it's not like, oh, you drive here, then you drive there, and more like, oh, you know, maybe you take the bus in, maybe you bike in, maybe you walk in, or maybe you just park your car in one location and then you walk around and you spend the day in Hartford and you go to the museum and you go get lunch and you go to a show and you go to the nightclub or you do whatever you want to do. And it's all in the same kind of contained, easily accessible space. People really like living their life in that way. And a big thing is, you know, is people don't go to Hartford for the day.
Right.
People used to go to Hartford. People used to take the bus in and do their shopping and have their fun, you know, because it was all right there and they could just land in one spot and they could get around easily. And we destroyed that concept in our city almost entirely. You know, you look at, even there's like a little micro example in Hartford, which is Pratt Street. Pratt Street's like the only pedestrianized street in Hartford. Yeah. And people really like it.
Oh yeah. And it took a lot of the business owners on Pratt a lot of time fighting to make it pedestrian only. Because it was, and then it wasn't, and then it was like. Yeah. And now that it's completely blocked off to cars, I think it really has. You know, there's a lot more parties and people do a lot more stuff there now.
And like walking on Main Street is not fun.
No.
Walking even on Farmington Ave, where I live in the West End, like it's not fun. And it's very difficult for people who can't afford cars. And that's, you know, and I talk about that, like pedestrianation is really nice, even if you can afford to drive everywhere. But if you can't afford a car in Hartford, it's very difficult. If you work in West Hartford,
it's incredibly challenging.
And you need to, like, people Uber everywhere, even though they can't barely afford it, you know, and people, because the buses aren't convenient and the buses don't run late night when people need to get home. Walking and biking, you know, even like if we just better designed, you know, Park Street for bike, like Park Street is such a small street and it's so chaotic. Like it would be such more of a pleasant place if there's less space for cars. Yeah, and it makes life very, very, very difficult if you don't own a car in the city, or if you do own a car and you're like me, you can barely afford a car.
Right.
You know, not only because gas prices, and we can talk gas prices nowadays, obviously that's the big thing, but, you know, but just insurance is a lot of money and cars break. Yeah. You know, and you need to fix them, and that doesn't really get solved with like electric cars and
no, and certainly fixing tires that get blown up by potholes.
Yes.
Well, yeah. That's not even what I was going to get onto. But thank you for bringing that up. My mind was blown by a couple of statistics in your podcast. One, talking about how many people in the city don't have a car.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Is way higher than I ever anticipated. I mean, I knew that it was high, but that was ridiculously high.
What was that number again?
It was, I think, around 30 to 40% of households in the city of Hartford don't have a... And again, like, that's one of those things where if you live in West Hartford or you live in Farmington, you're just... Or even around here, you're totally shielded from that reality.
Yeah,
because you don't see it.
Yep.
You don't see it. And then I saw, like, somebody wrote some opinion piece complaining about funding for bike lanes in Hartford.
Yep.
I'm like, what is wrong with you?
I'm going to be really interested to see what comes of this. What are they calling it? Luke Bronin's got some initiative this summer where they're closing down specific streets for Sundays to make them pedestrian only. And Park Street is going to be one of them.
Yeah.
And I'm really interested to see whether people decide that Park Street should just stay that way after seeing what it's like for a couple of weekends.
Yeah. And that wouldn't be the worst. That'd be pretty good.
I think Park Street would be really good for it. I think people just need to get out of their comfort zone and go to Park Street because it is really cool.
Park Street's amazing.
Park Street's fantastic.
Yeah, and you're not...
And not just down in the Parkville area.
Yeah.
Like, all of Park Street is really fascinating.
If you want good food, you will find it on Park Street.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Certainly.
Yeah.
And that's maybe what I would do. My next project would be about Park Road and Park Street. And because I do...
The level of diversity there.
Yeah, it's incredible. And, like, that's a really cool thing that I think we have in Hartford that I don't know if any, like, you know, talk about America, the world. Like, I mean, I don't know. You know, I'm just kind of speculating here. But to go from, like, in West Hartford, Park Road, where you have the diners, you know, you have a lot of cool stuff. You have, you know, a lot of really awesome restaurants. And you have... Oh gosh, what's it called? What's that Thai restaurant that's right across the street from Park Road?
It's like the King.
Yeah,
I know what you're talking about. Yes,
but it was a Thai restaurant before anyone knew what any Thai dish was.
Yeah. Oh yes,
It's in the cut.
Yep, I can think of exactly what. I don't know what the name of it is.
Yeah,
picture in my head.
Sorry, guys.
See, we need we all need visuals.
Yeah,
that's all of us. This is what we've learned today.
Yeah. So like some of the like Quaker Diner, Hall's Market, some of the oldest like institutions, you know, that are still really cool. And you go into Hartford, or you go to Parkville, and you have a lot of one of the biggest Portuguese and Brazilian, you know, communities, and outside of those respective countries, and a lot of really awesome food there. And Parkville Market, which is I don't care about, you know, it's cool, but again, I can go on a little rant about that if you want me to. I do like it, but you know.
I bet it begins with a G word.
But
good.
Very good.
But then, you know, then you go, I mean, you have to cross that stupid underpass and deal with the, you know, the strip mall and you know, the butchering of Pope Park. But then you get into Frog Hollow and, you know, you have a lot of cool, you know, Puerto Rican, Spanish food there and
amazing.
A lot of life there. It's really cool. Yeah, so much diversity. Yeah.
Besides Transportation Hartford, are there other Facebook groups or social media places that people should get involved with if they are passionate about this topic?
Yeah, so I mean on Facebook there's a few groups. I know there's one called Old Hartford that people share of photos of you know, Old Hartford.
That's a cool group.
Yeah, it's I believe the Facebook group is called Talking Transportation, and that's where people share some things. There is the Greater Hartford Mobility Study, which is the guys who did the from the Department of Transportation, and that's kind of a place where you can say your piece about what you think this city should be in the future, because there are going to be changes. I think, you know, people have realized that. People in government have realized. We talked about, you know, Congressman Larson, you know, has definitely seen the highway as a problem. Like I didn't discover this, you know, that this was an issue. It's pretty well known.
I don't think I've ever heard anybody complain about the roads here in Hartford.
So if you just want to get involved, I think the more people that are aware of this and that are activists for this in any small way, and just kind of, even if they just say their piece, so the people in power know this is what we want. We don't like this. We don't like the way the city is run. I'm not a total pessimist, and I think things can be done. I would say, there's going to be plenty of events. Hopefully now that things are, fingers crossed, opening up again, hopefully for good. And we can have events in the future. I went to the Hartford Public Library on Main Street. If you ever just want to do any research into the history of Hartford, that's the place to go. And I'm sure there will be events in the future, and we'll see. And I think I've talked to people. You can look up Hartford 400 online as well. That's another project that's in the works. There are people who are thinking of things and creating a movement within the city. And I think it's going to need to come from everyone. All from all walks of life to come together, and I think we just need to do that. So there will be hopefully events soon. We'll see.
If any city can do it, it's us.
Yeah.
Could not agree more.
Promote yourself.
Okay. So my podcast is called The Road That Killed a City. You can look it up on pretty much any place you listen to podcasts. So Spotify, Apple, Amazon, Google, Stitcher. I have it on a few other places. You can look it up on theroadthatkilledacity.com. And there's not much other than the podcast. And I have a little visual story where I have kind of locations that I found photos of from back before the highway was built. And then I took pictures from those exact same spots. So I think that's a really cool thing you can look at.
Social media handles?
Yeah. Is there any way that our listeners could find you, get in touch with you if any of them happen to have some more information they'd like to share with you about this topic?
The road that killed the city.com, my email is on there if you want to email me. I've gotten some really cool emails. I've gotten some really angry emails.
Ooh, maybe we're going to ask some more questions.
At
angry emails?
Yeah. Oh, somebody said, I listened to the first part of the first episode and I had to turn it off. And then he accused me of jumping to conclusions about my podcast.
Was he 150 years old?
I don't know.
Oh my goodness.
So, but I didn't respond to him just because you're not supposed to.
You're not supposed to.
I don't want to get into a fight with someone over that.
Facts.
Yeah.
Right.
At the Jim Krueger on Twitter, the Jim Krueger, because as I said, I'm not incredibly humble, so I call myself the Jim Krueger. And then
journalist.
Yeah. So you can. I'll share stuff that people share about the highway there. I'll also share some jokes because I try to be a comedian at times. Most of the time it doesn't land. Sometimes it does.
You are funny. I know you offline. You're funny.
And completely unrelated, the wise old dog.
Oh,
if you want wine suggestions, that's my main job now. Mm-hmm. So,
fancy.
Yes,
fantastic.
Very fancy.
Let's do the 3 questions.
All right.
Fabulous.
So,
first question.
Outside of the highway, if you could change one thing about the city of Hartford, and only one thing.
There was actually Tony Charles said, I asked him that same question, and he said, "Don't give me that power. I'm less I'm less humble." I mean, I would probably bring back the old layout to Hartford before all the urban renewal. So I'd bring back kind of like the tighter streets. I want a tram line. Too. I think that would be cool.
Yes.
If I could do that, I'd put that in.
Bring back the Farmington Avenue tram.
That would be really awesome, yeah.
No, there's some new tram technology is so much cooler.
Well, I don't mean bring back the literal tram.
Yeah.
I mean, oh my goodness, Liz.
Come on.
I want bullet trains.
Okay, so second question.
Bullet train from Farmington to Hartford?
What is hidden gems? What are your favorite hidden gems in Hartford?
My favorite hidden gems are probably all food related. I would say Island Cuisine on Farmington Ave. Really good. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if these are hidden gems from me, a guy from Hartford, or a guy from West Hartford, I should say. For some people, it'd be like, yeah, whatever. La Estrella Bakery in Parkville. I know the owner. I love her very much. So gotta shout that one out. Really awesome. They have those like egg custard things that are really delicious. I forget the name, and if I tried to pronounce the name, I'd butcher it. And another one, I would say Donde Julio in Frog Hollow is a Colombian restaurant that is very, very, very delicious. And it's like Colombian food is like just pure decadence. So like you'll have a sandwich with like pork belly and fries and beef and mayo, and it's like, that's it. And it's like awesome.
What's your favorite thing about Hartford?
I do really love the community of people who like actually do live in Hartford and, you know, kind of stick through it all, because there is, I really think, like just, you know, real genuineness to the people there. And, you know, like they really care. And a lot of times they care because there's no one else who cares, you know, in the decision-making world. Like when no one's fixing the side of the road, you know, you'll have people who just take their own time out of their own day to like garden, you know, in public space. So I think that's really cool, especially like now that I'm in the West End, you know, there's just like a lot of familiar faces that you just kind of see everywhere. And I also just love the architecture, and I love the houses in the West End. They're all very pretty.
I agree with you. Yeah.
Not enough people talk about that.
We live in a darn cute city.
We really do. Thank you so much for coming on today.
You're welcome.
Jim.
This was a lot of fun.
Woo!
A lot of fun.
Thanks for listening to The Heartbeat with your host, Cam and D-Rock.
We hope you enjoyed our interview today with Jim Krueger. Be sure to check out his podcast, The Road That Killed a City, wherever you're listening to this episode.
Join us next week when we'll be sitting down with comedians Rob Santos and Mike Massaro about what went down last week at the Oscars and the impact it will or won't have on the world of stand-up comedy.
As always, you can head over to theheartbeatct.com to sign up for our email list, as well as to check out all the links and resources in the show notes.
Thank you, as always, to the Spigot Cafe for hosting us, to Jim Krueger for joining us, and to Javon Carlo for producing and editing the show.
That's all for this episode, folks. See you next week.